Okay, very good. We're at 12 noon, so it's time for us to get underway with our session today. Let me start off by welcoming everyone who has joined us. We appreciate you making time to come listen in to some information we'd like to share with you. And we'll be following the same format in today's webinar that we've been following in the prior weeks, and that is, you'll notice as you come in that our participants are not able to share video or audio. However, we do have our Q&A channel and the chat channels open. And we'll be keeping an eye on those channels and would encourage you to participate, ask questions, share comments, whatever, as we go through the session. My name is Jennifer Ray, and I work with APARO and look after the education piece of our programs, events like webinars such as this, training activities for nonprofits, and tech coaching activities for nonprofits. And today, what we've done is invite some guests to speak with us to help us kind of wrap our minds around managing all this unexpected change that is happening around us, even today as we speak. And who knows how long these changes will continue to unfold. But the idea today is to share a little bit of information to help us kind of get grounded in how we move ahead with all this change that's in front of us. And I'm not talking about, you know, high-level change management plans. All of us kind of got caught unawares here. It just happened. So the question now is, what do we do with all this? How do we bring some framework around what we're dealing with and try to be a little bit more intentional as we go forward in dealing with this change? So to address that, we've invited a couple of speakers to join us today. If you've been with us before, you might remember having met TJ Felice from Centric Consulting. He has worked us through a session on Teams with one of his colleagues, and we've invited him to come back today to help us talk about managing change. And that's because his firm does a lot of work in the change management arena, and he can really help us wrap our minds around this. We've also invited one of our nonprofit partners, Sandra O'Connor from Matthews Help Center. And she has been working with TJ on this very subject and can really help add to the conversation from a pragmatic viewpoint in terms of how to wrap your mind around these things. So the first thing I'd like to do is give TJ a moment to introduce himself and Sandra a moment to introduce herself. And then TJ, when you're ready, I'll pull up that first slide on the deck and we'll be off to the races. But let me turn it over to you to just introduce yourself and make a quick statement or two.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. So great to be with you guys all again today. My name is TJ Felice. I run the Charlotte business unit for a management consulting firm called Centric Consulting. Centric's been around for 20 years, focused on providing technology and management consulting solutions in the local geographies we serve. So one of the things I love about Centric is that it gives us time and opportunity to give back to areas in our local community that we're passionate about. And I've been fortunate enough to be involved with APARO over the past few years, as well as with Matthews Help Center. And that's really where I've been fortunate enough to build my relationship with Sandra over the past 3 years. So I'm really thrilled to be on this discussion with her. So Sandra, how about if I turn it over to you to provide more of an intro?
Sure. So my name is Sandra Conway, and I am the Executive Director with the Matthews Help Center. And I've been the Executive Director for 2 years. So boy, this is a big, we've got a big event happening as a relatively still new Executive Director. But the Matthews Help Center has been part of the community for 40 years, and we're here to help our neighbors survive a financial crisis. And we do that by providing short-term assistance. So we are called more than ever before to serve during this difficult time, and that's a little bit about us.
Thank you. Thank you. So, TJ, as I was saying when I was first introducing the session today, you know, as you and I have talked about, most of us, well, the whole world essentially, got thrust into a situation without any real planning to speak of. I've heard some people say, gee, you know, we were planning about 2 weeks out. We kind of figured this was going to happen, but still 2 weeks is not that long. So here we are in the middle of all this we didn't create a roadmap. We need a starting point. How do we wrap our minds around what's going on here?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and obviously one everyone is wrestling with. So as you bring up the slides, no rush. You might actually see this in action. Personally dealing with unplanned change, I have two teenagers at home doing remote learning, and my neighbor is putting in a fence that you may hear the chainsaw going in the background as they remove a few trees. So we'll see if I can walk the walk and manage unplanned change in real time. But first, as you talked about, if we can go to the first slide, Jennifer, it's really important to think about change in a few different ways. You know, there are different kinds of change, and they all afford us different luxuries with regards to how we respond. So, you know, there's two real drivers or matrices that affect how we can either initiate or respond to change. And that's internal and external change. And then is it planned or unplanned change? And those are things that affect, you know, how we bring our resources to bear in order to respond to the situation. Jennifer, I think if you hover over the solid black line under the slide, if you go under and then right there, you should be able to hover on that black line. There you go, and you can pull down the notes.
Hey,
there it is. Awesome.
I'm sorry for interrupting for just a second. TJ, remind me, did we have a trouble? I think we had trouble when we went into slideshow mode. I'm just going to try it to see if it works.
Okay, let's see. So far, this is looking good. Oh, that's awesome. That's great.
Okay, perfect. So that's why I left it in slide mode. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
No worries. It's all good. If that's the biggest change I've got to deal with, Jennifer, you're going to make it easy on me.
Yes.
So let's talk first about the easiest kind of change to manage, and that's the planned internal change. You can think about this as strategic, proactive change. Jennifer, if you want to hit the space key once, we'll bring that up. So, you know, this is where you are intentionally thinking about changing the way that you operate, whether that's bringing a new product or a new service to market, maybe changing the way your organization is structured. These are all kinds of choices that as leaders or as members of an organization, we predominantly control what the change is and how over a time perspective it needs to be deployed. So this is the easiest kind of change to manage. Next, if you click again, Jennifer, we have planned external change. So these may be changes that we may not have initiated ourselves, but still were afforded a pretty big luxury of time. So these are things like the introduction of a new technology, whether that be a new platform like Salesforce that you decide to use. Maybe it's just a software upgrade. Maybe it's a way that you communicate with business partners because, you know, maybe something has changed from a business partner perspective. Again, these changes are external, but we again have the luxury of time to really think about how do we want to align our resources and how do we want to initiate and kind of implement this change across our teams. Now we're going to move down to the unplanned side, right? Things get a lot more hectic when we get unplanned. So Jennifer, if you click again, we should bring up unplanned internal change. So these are things, for example, if a key employee decides to leave, okay, that's unplanned, and you may not have as much luxury of time as you would have liked. Maybe it's a change in skills that are required of your team members. Maybe through automation, we need to train our employees. Maybe we need to get them comfortable with a new skill. Again, this is something that's unplanned, but it's predominantly driven by internal things to our organization. And then last but not least, the hardest change we have to adapt to is the one we find ourselves in today. And these are things that are driven externally, where we have very little knowledge or foresight that they're coming. Sometimes these are things like regulations. Sometimes regulations happen and they don't give you a lot of lead time to adapt and to change course in order to comply. Sometimes it's economic or political changes that happen globally. You know, it wasn't too long ago where we had the luxury of time before we felt the ripples of things that happened around the world. Now we live in a world where in a matter of days, we can implement a change here in the US in response to something that happens halfway around the world. So unplanned changes that happen really without any inclination that they may be coming, it's really just a nature of where we are. That's going to be something that happens more and more frequently. So what do we do about those changes? Well, before we get there, I did want to talk a little bit about, you know, what does change look like when you, I'm sorry, you can go ahead, Jennifer. What does change look like when you step back and look at the effects of change, regardless of which of those four types of change we talk about? You know, one of the things that I think it's really important to understand is that anytime you initiate change, things typically get worse from a performance perspective before they get better. And that's really what this graph is intended to depict. If you look at that yellow line, which is kind of the best case scenario, that's what we try to aim for when Centric as a consulting firm comes in and helps one of our clients manage change. We show them this graph and we say, look, here's the value of being really well thought out and well architected about how you implement and deploy change. There are two real drivers that our clients are concerned about. The first is if you look at the valley that follows kind of that straight line coming off of the performance axis, you know, you want to minimize the depth of that valley as much as possible. You want to minimize how bad things get before they start to get better, okay? And the way that we do that is by focusing entirely on the people side of change, something we call adoption. How do you get people comfortable with and prepared for the upcoming change? That really affects the depth of that valley that's depicted in the picture there. The next thing that we try to talk to our clients about is the upslope on that yellow line. And that is around, hey, have we really designed a better mousetrap? Do we really think the future version of work or the mission of our organization, do we really think that's a better place than where we are today? Again, if you think back to that planned internal approach, when you have the luxury of time, you can design a really good future state. You can be very intentional in thinking about where you're headed. So the likelihood is really high that you're moving to a better way of doing things in the future. So adoption and design, or really attention to detail and where you're headed, give you a good likelihood of hitting that yellow line. But what happens if you don't have the luxury of planning? Unplanned external change like we have today. You know, no one really had the luxury of thinking through all the different variables associated with the world we find ourselves in today. Things were changing on a daily basis. So there really wasn't a future state that we could focus on and you know, tell a compelling message to our stakeholders that said, don't worry, things are going to get better. We know where we're going. We have a path. We have a journey. It was really crisis management. It was really about focusing on the people and making sure that we were sending the right message to prepare them for the journey that lied ahead, even though we knew on a daily basis it was going to change. So the real key takeaway from this slide is when you're in unplanned external change, when you're in crisis mode, we really don't have the luxury of being able to talk about where we're headed. Instead, we have to fall on a few guiding principles to help keep our people engaged and motivated and keeping them focused on taking kind of one day at a time and working towards managing through the crisis. Sandra, I think you might have had a quick story you wanted to share about the experience at Matthews, and you saw kind of that change adoption occur in real life.
Yeah, so as our social work team, you know, we are guided by having those one-on-one appointments with clients and them actually coming into our building. So we did have to close down our facility and switch to a virtual mode of operation because we still needed to help people, and we were really passionate about how to do that. So we had to literally overnight go to some type of format that we could still engage them and be able to help them and pay their bills and help in the way that we wanted to help. So, but we weren't set up to do that. So it did take a couple of tries, and the contact form became a little bit of a struggle for our clients on the other end, trying to give us the documentation that we needed to kind of move forward and get them in and get them food and pay those bills. So we're on our third revision. It's going to go out today, and it's all based on client feedback. We're asking them, how was that form process for you? What can we do to make this easier for you? And so it's just been a trial and error, and it really, at this point, I think we're really encouraged that we're going to be in a better place than where we were last month, being able to help people. And we're starting to see some benefits as a result of this. You know, our clients, when they're in crisis mode, which they're in even more now, but let's say before this, sometimes it's hard to come to their appointment. You know, sometimes they have to take multiple bus rides to get to Matthews Help Center, or they have to miss their mode of their means of income. And so we have really heard that, you know, they can send these documents to us at midnight, and we'll collect them the next day and be able to process and help them through. So we see some benefits, but to get there initially, to think that we were going to do remote virtual work, that was not on our radar at all. That wasn't something we thought we could do, or that the client could participate in to do. So it's changing our mindset.
Sandra, can you talk a little bit about the social worker director, what her reaction was when you kind of floated this idea to her?
So she's been a social worker for 17 years, and the thought of doing any type of vetting process or not having contact with your client, it was something that she just thought we weren't going to be able to do. So I knew, just that I know her, that we were going to have to dive in, but I also needed her to have the buy-in along the way. And I have to say, I walked through the office this morning. She was talking to a client. She was getting feedback on the contact form. She told me she needed a check to pay their rent, and she was smiling. And this is huge. This is huge for us.
That's awesome. It's a great story, and it is so indicative of how most people respond to change. You know, there's skepticism, especially in a situation like today, where we haven't had the chance to do things like a pilot or a test. You know, it's kind of, we're going to kind of make this up as we go, with lack of a better term, and iterate through and recognize that that it's going to be uncomfortable. It's going to require some resilience. But at the end of the day, again, if we come back to those guiding principles, those things that we're going to talk about here next, I think we can be confident we're going to end up in the right spot. So just a great story to share. Thank you.
Hey, TJ, I have a question for you. When I look at the slide and, you know, the downslope for the disruption, when you're in the midst of a situation like this that's completely unplanned, you know, and you're just going every day the best you can, how do you know when that disruption should be coming to a close? Like, how do you know you've been in it long enough or too long, or like, what's just the right amount? What are the indicators that I know, aha, I just need to hang in there until I get here, or whatever?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Jennifer, and it's so unique to each situation. But I will tell you that, for me at least, when I've seen this happen in crises like we're in today, right? To me, the best leading indicator is the morale of your team members. It is the morale of the group of people you are working with. If you, as the leader, as the person who is kind of on point for managing through the crisis, if you can keep people engaged, if you can keep them aligned on the mission, good things will happen, and you will come out of that valley of despair eventually, just because people will be focused on the big picture. They will find creative ways to fulfill the mission of the organization. And it may not be, you know, the big idea that we as leaders might have come up with. It could be something completely organic that someone contributes as part of being focused on the mission and being committed to where the organization's trying to go. So I wish I could tell you there were more quantifiable benchmarks. When you're dealing with plan change, there are, because you can set those up and you can work towards them. But when you're in unplanned change, for me, it's really hard to tell you that there's a hard and fast rule without understanding more about the particular situation. Sandra, do you have anything to add to that, or Jennifer, a follow-up question?
No, I think that the morale is huge, and because that's going to guide kind of what you're doing, to listen to how they're feeling. And we have a couple of different groups we have to consider. We have our volunteers, our donors, and then our clients. So we have to really listen. That's why that feedback form, and asking that feedback on that form to our clients is very simple, but it's indicative how we're going to operate. That information is crucial right now.
Yeah, what really strikes me about what you said, TJ, is, I totally get what you're saying about no hard, fast rules. There aren't benchmarks when it's unplanned and that kind of thing. But you did give pretty concrete indicators: engagement and focused on the mission. Mm-hmm. And what strikes me is, it's a lot like in the infant toddler world when you're measuring development. Infants and toddlers who don't have language, you have to look at other indicators, and level of engagement is huge in that world. And to translate that into what we're doing, I think that's actionable. That is something understandable that we can sink our teeth into and do something with, So I'm thrilled to hear you offer that as indicators to look for.
Awesome, great.
Yeah, are we ready for the next slide?
Yes, I think we are. So these are the much beleaguered guiding principles that I've been promising. So again, you may find them a little soft. They're not as task oriented, if you will, as consultants like to be. But again, in the midst of a crisis, things are so fluid that you have to have kind of globally applicable principles, because things are so different depending on the crisis. So what I like about these are that they can be applied to a myriad of different situations. They're not just relevant for today's crisis. They can even be applied to planned internal change, if you'd like to take them there. So I'm happy to answer more questions, happy to kind of explore these with you guys, but I'm kind of preparing you up front. This is not a task list of things to do and then you've successfully managed the crisis. Unfortunately, it doesn't work quite that way. One quick thing I'd like to build on you said, Jennifer, about the mission. That's one advantage I think I can generally state that the nonprofit world has over our private sector clients. Almost everyone I am lucky enough to speak with at the nonprofits I engage with, you are all so tightly aligned and so passionate about your missions. That's a real advantage. In many of our larger clients, there's a lot of people are kind of going their own way, right? They're part of a department and they're focused on their department goal. They may not be as motivated by the overarching mission of, a 30,000 person organization, for example. So, the advantage you all have is being passionate about your mission. Everyone who's on your teams can typically articulate it. They know when they're aligned with it, they can get that feeling of delivering against their mission. And so that is something I think is a real advantage when you are faced with crisis versus other organizations that just have so many different groups with so many different agendas. I think it's much harder to get that sense of alignment and moving forward in the same direction. So just with that comment, when faced with a crisis, the first thing you should do, even though I have focus on the people, I forgot truly step one, which is resist the urge to respond immediately. I kind of skipped over that one, so it's worth noting that it's usually a really good idea to take a step back and do just some personal assessment and grounding with yourself if you're the person who's going to be taking responsibility for navigating the crisis. There's always an urge to respond quickly, and I would really caution against that. These 5 principles don't take long to get through. If it is something that you can respond to quickly, I really don't think this is going to inhibit you from being timely, but it could be a great savior in responding too quickly without thinking about all the different facets that might be involved in the crisis. So step one is really resist the urge to respond quickly. Step two, think, and I'm going to go back to step one, but focus on the people. Sandra kind of touched on this, right? All of you guys have different stakeholder groups that need to be thought about and will ultimately need to be communicated with. You know, she mentioned employees, volunteers, social workers, her clients. She didn't even mention the board members, right? Which all you guys have board members that, you know, you need to keep happy or else they're going to start grumbling at you. So there's all kinds of stakeholder groups that you need to think about. And you need to think about, how do I keep these people kind of engaged, informed, and get them the information they need? Each of those groups is going to have different needs across all those things. And if you can think about who those groups are and what's the way I'm going to kind of initiate, communicate with them, that's very important. Step two then is taking responsibility. Who's going to be the point of contact for kind of navigating through the crisis? A couple key points to focus on here. This does not mean one person has all the answers, right? That is not what this means. What this does mean is there kind of needs to be one person who's facilitating the management of the entire process. Someone who's kind of on point for issuing communication, someone who's on point for assessing information that might be gathered by members of the response team. There always has to be kind of one leader, but that leader really should call on experts, either internally or externally to their teams, other subject matter experts, maybe peers. I know Sandra's had a couple of conversations with other peer nonprofits, and they've traded best practices and traded ideas on things. So you need someone who's involved in kind of the visible focal point of managing through the crisis. So that's step two.
TJ, may I just
Sure.
reiterate something you said, or I want to make sure I understood what you said. You said that the person taking responsibility doesn't necessarily know all the answers. They don't have all the answers, but they're the person you go to ask the question, and then they facilitate whatever the next steps are. That's really what you're saying. Nobody has all the answers right now, right?
Exactly right. That's absolutely right. And you know, that's if you think about larger organizations, right? Many of our clients are doing this. You have department leads who are taking responsibility for their department, but they're working in conjunction with their peers. They're working in conjunction with guidance that's being brought down from the executive team at the corporation. You know, look at the situation even just in our government, right? You've got each individual governor who's kind of visible. Then you have county leaders who's visible at the county level. So you do have these different layers of individuals who are taking responsibility in those larger kinds of groups. In many of the organizations that are here today, you may not have that. You may just have one person who's visible, who's providing leadership to the entire group. That's fine that it's one person, but behind the scenes, it is still a multitude of people who are helping that one person figure out what it is that should be done, when it should be done, providing input, suggestions, right, validation. So it's really incumbent on that one person to assemble that team that they want to rely on to help provide the guidance they feel is appropriate. Does that answer your question, Jennifer?
Sure does. Thank you.
All right. So next is the really hard phase, the assessment phase. Before you can respond, it's really important to understand what is needed in the response. And the real challenge here is that these needs vary by stakeholder group almost all the time. So if you think about the groups Sandra mentioned, right, employees, volunteers, clients, they all have different questions. They all have different concerns. How you manage responding to those needs and concerns has to be triaged. And that's what this assessment phase is all about. This is why kind of resisting that urge to respond right out of the gate is so important, because what you might think is the most important stakeholder group and the most important need might not be true. And that's what this assessment phase is intended to figure out. So the next slide, when we get to it, gives you a tool to help kind of capture and think about assessing your stakeholder groups in a consistent way, so you can then prioritize, okay, here's who I think has the most important need, and I think this is the need that we need to respond to first. And you can begin to kind of line up those priorities and begin to figure out a plan, right? Who do we respond to first? What action do we take first? And how do we communicate that? So Jennifer, if you click ahead to the task, I think it's the task implementation or.
May I ask you a question before?
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Okay, one for you and one for Sandra. Okay, I'm starting to hyperventilate when I see assess needs in the middle of all of this craziness. What in the world? Let's talk about what that means, because it doesn't have to be like Sandra. I'm jumping ahead, but what caught me was you're assessing your clients on the fly. You're not using some fancy and needs assessment kind of thing. So anyway, I'm jumping around here, but I started to hyperventilate. I wanted us to address that. So TJ, please.
I'll go first and I'll keep it quick because you're right. In a crisis, you don't have time to do an assessment like you do for a planned internal change, right? So I'm glad you called this out. It is a back of the napkin brainstorming activity, right? With a small knit group of folks who walk the walk daily, the people who interact with the stakeholder groups on a daily basis. You can do this assessment in an hour. If you get the right people in a room, throw the ideas up on the whiteboard, you can walk out of there with a good idea of how you're going to take action. So thank you for clarifying that. And I'll turn it over to Sandra to maybe provide a real world example.
Yeah, I go back to that meeting with my team when we made the decision that we were going to put out our COVID response about closing, and just we really try to prioritize those basic things we need to take care of. Like, just what is the basic things we need to communicate out. Our clients need to know we're here to serve them. How are we going to do that? Send them an email. Great. Our volunteer force, they needed to make sure that they're still engaged. So we came up with some ideas that we can keep them engaged. Of course, our community needed to be aware of what we were doing and how we're going to do that. But I tell you, I remember talking at the very end of the meeting saying, you know, they're looking to me for answers, and I'm like, I don't have all the answers, and you know what? That's okay. You know, it's okay for us not to have all the answers. And then the plan we're talking today may change tomorrow, and it has changed multiple times. My sheets of paper, I can't even tell you. It's just one of those things where it's just changing all the time. But I think it's important to see that your assessment needs are all still the same. If I can get to the basic things we need to work on and then come up with a new way to look at it, then we're going to be okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, really well said, Sandra. That's great.
All right.
So take action. This is where you don't want to do this at step 0. You want to do this at step 4. And the reason why this is so important is because the action that you take is going to do a couple things. Okay. First, it's going to address some of the needs that you've assessed because you've been intentional about what you're doing. Secondly, it's going to give you the opportunity to gather some feedback, right? Like Sandra said, some response. By taking action, by doing something, there's going to be a response to that action. Could be good, could be not favorable, but either way it's good because it's going to give you feedback that you can then respond to again. Remember, this whole process is iterative, right? Those arrows going around the circle are there for a reason. That's why it's okay that you're not going to have a completely thought out, integrated plan as you're doing this. You're not. External forces are going to keep changing what that end goal looks like, right? So the best laid plans today are going to be completely, kind of inapplicable tomorrow because things have changed. So taking action is important because it shows that you're being responsive. It demonstrates that you're listening to your stakeholders and trying to respond to their needs. And then it's also going to provide you feedback from them that says, yes, this is good, or no, maybe we could think about this a different way. Which brings me to the last point around communication. Again, this is where the person who's taking responsibility, this is such a key role for them. I mean, if you think about it, this is really the only time all the stakeholders get to interact with the person taking responsibility. That person behind the scenes is doing steps 1 through 5, but all the stakeholders only see step 5. right? So it's really important when you are communicating to focus on how you arrived at the priorities that you did, right? In other words, focusing back to the guiding principles about your mission. Our mission is to provide short-term financial assistance to those in the Matthews area. I'm kind of butchering the Matthews Health Center mission, right? So Sandra is basing her communication around that mission. So in response to that, in order to keep our clients safe, here's what we're doing. In order to keep our volunteers safe, here's what we're doing, right? Safety was first and foremost in how she wanted to communicate. So she prioritized that. She assessed what each of those groups needed as far as communication, and then she communicated. You know, she heard back from the volunteers, which is great. She has a passionate set of volunteers. I don't want to not come in. I want to come in and help. I know you need me. What can I do? So that was a response Sandra got to some of her messaging. So this iterative process, though, is fantastic because it builds on some of the things that make nonprofits so compelling, and that is your mission. If you're engaging people in a way that they relate to your mission, that will build a reinforcement ability around your communication, the actions you take, and then the needs that you're continually assessing. So I'll stop there. Sandra, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add on this slide. I think you might have, but maybe not.
No, I think you, I'm just going to be honest. I think I may have jumped on a couple of, I don't think I did all of those in order, but that's okay.
That's okay.
Always have every day is a new day to start over again. And so, but it was hard at the very, very beginning, not initially to kind of, to kind of slow down in the moment when everything was so crazy around you. I think that was probably the hardest thing to do. And especially for those type folks out there that are, want to get things done. And this is probably really hard to be able to step back and take these different steps. But I think it's really good visually to see that.
It is. I'm sorry, Jennifer, real quick. I'm glad you mentioned that, Sandra. As you iterate through this, there's absolutely complete flexibility in jumping around from step to step. That is completely fine. I think the only time I would say you really should tackle them in order is the first time through it, your initial response to the crisis. I think it's really important to think about things sequentially. But after that, I think it's fine to kind of hit on the high points of this cycle as external factors come to bear and as your stakeholders demand it. I think that flexibility is fine.
Yeah, I was just going to say the two things that struck me, Sandra, that you said that really I'm walking away from this slide. Number one, you didn't necessarily do everything in sequence. You touched on these things, but you addressed it as you could address it. And I think that's important. And the second thing that I found really interesting, you're talking about assessing needs, and sometimes the answer to the assessment was, I don't know. I don't know, what do we do? So I think that's important to say, again, reiterate, we might not know right in the moment, but to go back to what TJ's saying, we're going through these processes and they're in our minds and we keep coming back to it and getting better and better as we do it. But we're just not going to have all the answers at one time. And we don't have to necessarily follow, ABC to the letter every step of the way. It just won't work.
Right.
Okay, you ready for the next one?
Yes. Okay, so, and you can go ahead to the next slide too, Jennifer.
Yeah.
So, this approach, this is not a centric approach. I'm gonna, on the following slide, I'll show you where we pulled this information from, and it's a great resource that's available at no charge that I'd like to share with everyone because they provide a number of different tools and techniques like this to help assess and manage change. So I'll share that with you here at the end, but this is one of their tools, and they call it the Today, Tomorrow Assessment. So really, it's just a simple kind of structure or framework for thinking about what is changing from today to tomorrow. And it gives you some lenses or different vectors to think about change. I only wanted to talk about 3 today, but they give you a pretty exhaustive list there. The middle column where it says, assess the needs of each stakeholder group, you can think about this as granular or as big pictures you like. So the biggest picture is stakeholder group, right? So you can think about what do our clients need? How are the nature in which we serve our clients, how is that going to change from today to tomorrow? It could be more granular. For your employees, it may be, again, I'll use Matthews Help Center as an example. How do things change for our social work team? And that's going to be very different than how things change for our food pantry team. So internally, maybe you get a little more granular, right? Maybe it's not just employees, maybe it's some kind of job function that you begin to do this exercise for. So you talk about the change, right? It's this quick whiteboarding session that I mentioned earlier. The most important outcome here, folks, is not that you've got a really good plan for how things happen tomorrow. There's too much uncertainty. The biggest outcome is how important is it that we talk about this now? There's so much going on. You cannot address every answer in every stakeholder group in one time. You just cannot do that. So prioritizing where are you going to spend your time first, that's the real outcome of this exercise that adds value. So that's the outcome you want to shoot for. I would argue, although the folks I'm going to refer you to later, they would probably be mad at me for saying this. I could tell you that maybe you don't even do the take action step until you've done that prioritization, and then you go back through and only figure out how are we going to take action on the highest priority items. That to me is a more effective use of your time when you're in a crisis. So some examples here. I'm gonna ask Sandra to share just a couple of examples of processes and systems and maybe even tools that she went through. She didn't even know that this kind of framework existed. She just did this on her own. So it's a great success story.
So I shared about the social work going virtually. So, you know, that was our big one that was on that list. But I want to kind of go through, you know, the systems that we had to go through. I mentioned we had to have a couple of different revisions on the form, the intake form, and I had to make sure my team knew that it's okay that we are having to make all these course adjustments, because we're going down the road and all of a sudden we have to make that quick right turn and then make another left turn. So it was going to be okay. And I think the tools piece of that is that we are learning a lot more technology than we've ever had to learn at Matthews Help Center. And just briefly, we had a database that we'd had for almost 15 years that was really not functional. And so we got our new database a couple of years ago, and boy, we are so excited. So it's little things like this right now during this time that we're realizing that this is the time right now for us to kind of experiment and do some things that we're not comfortable doing, because we've got some time to work on some things so that we can come out of this we can serve our client in a better way. So we're really trying to take advantage of this time right now to kind of reimagine our organization, still stick with our mission and our vision, but how do we see ourselves coming out of this? And now's the time that we can actually build those stepping stones into some of our processes.
Yeah, that's great. So, you know, moving from the in-person social work first interview to something that can now be done remotely, right. You know, that started with a question. Right, that started with, can we do this? Mm-hmm. And through some debate and discussion with your team internally, you guys decided to give it a shot, right? You knew technically there was a way to do it. You didn't know if your end clients would be responsive. Mm-hmm. You didn't know until you tried. So you put that idea out there, you communicated it, you took action by offering this new channel, and they responded. You know, they demonstrated, yeah, we can do this. So that is a great example of, you know, kind of basing your response on those guiding principles, giving something a try. And once it was kind of adopted by your clients, you now have the ability to leverage that in your new tomorrow, right? If you think back to that yellow line, you now have the ability to make that yellow line kind of continue to trend upward, because you've leveraged a whole new way to serve your clients. And so it's one of the neat forms of innovation that can come from situations like this. It's really interesting.
It really, you know, the other thing that strikes me is the role that technology is playing in your ability to shift how you're delivering your services. And it continues to fascinate and thrill me, the geek in me. how critical. I mean, can you imagine, think of the stories we're hearing about people who are essentially, they're dead in the water because they do not have technology enabling them to make that connection, either as a recipient of service or a deliverer of service.
Mm-hmm. Now, a great example of that, I think, Jennifer, is, at least for my kids, is how school is now being conducted.
Yes.
You know, no school, to my knowledge, at least no high school that my kids have told me about, had the ability to do distance learning at scale. And so they all had to respond, right, to a true crisis. How do I now connect with thousands and thousands of students in a way that, you know, is affordable and allows me to still scale, allows that ability for students to engage with their teachers and do it in a way that allows them to learn and fulfill the mission of the school. So from a technology perspective, right, systems, they had to bring to bear whole new systems that didn't exist, right? Thank goodness we have partners like Zoom and Microsoft who made, you know, those kinds of platforms free and provided some training to help schools make that transition. That's fantastic. What I've noticed, though, when I dig deeper into actually how my kids are being taught, the process of teaching has changed. For them, many of their teachers have now adopted the whole flip the classroom approach, which some of them did before, but no longer is their class time spent on lecturing. That is now their homework, right? They're either reading the content or scanning notes or attending Khan Academy sessions to learn new concepts. But their class time is now spent on reviewing problems, asking questions, you know, getting that one-on-one or one-on-many time with the teacher that really helps facilitate the knowledge they're trying to gain. So the teaching process has changed, the teaching systems have changed, and some of the tools are no longer there. I was talking to my daughter, who's a big STEM student. She loves her chemistry class. She is so disappointed they don't have tools, right? She can't do experiments anymore. She now has to watch the experiments online and still do the work, but she can't provide the hands-on kind of experience of doing the experiments. So those are some examples of how this framework can allow you to think about the impacts of these various things.
Well, and to take that one step further, TJ, you know, what's really interesting is you think about education specifically, since you brought that up as an example. You know, the notion of the flipped classroom has been around a long time, and there's lots of empirical data to support the efficacy of that pedagogical model. But our education systems have been slow to adopt. Now, that's not an indictment against education. What I'm saying is, when we have big systems and big companies and big whatever, it's much harder to change in advance of something like this pandemic so that you can pivot immediately and continue to, it's an example of lag time between what we know can help, technology, flipped classroom, whatever, versus actually having the will and the budget and all these other things to actually make those changes until you get backed against a wall. So to go back to Sandra's point, we're at a unique position in time to really consider these things and brainstorm and envision how things could be different for the next time. Hopefully we don't have it, but you know, yeah.
No, it's so true. You know, one of the hardest things that our clients are challenged with, that we're often asked to help, is put together what they call the case for change, right? Because in many cases, change is a choice. And the stakeholders you're speaking to, the first question they typically ask is, why do I have to change? Well, in a crisis, you have to change because the old way of doing things is no longer an option, right? Students can no longer go to school. So you have to change. There isn't a choice. The case for change is the situation you're in. So that's why managing the people side of things here is so important, because, as Sandra said, getting them comfortable with the fact that we don't have all the answers. The answers we have are likely to change. So the right answer, right, the end state that we're headed in is a journey. And this is just the first step on that journey. Hopefully it's in the right direction, but it may not be. And if it's not, we'll change course and we'll get realigned and we'll move there too. but getting people prepared for the kind of journey you're embarking on is what builds resiliency, and it gets them the right expectation to keep engaged throughout the process. And that's what's really key.
Indeed. Okay, shall we move to our next slide and give folks an idea about this resource we were talking about?
Sure, happy to do so. So this is the last slide in the deck, just to prepare folks in the audience. So I'd love to talk a little bit about ProSci. ProSci is an organization that's been around for many, many years. They really assess the whole idea of change management and change adoption. Their whole organization has been built on studies and methodologies around how people respond to change. So they have a myriad of toolkits and frameworks and things that you can leverage at no cost. They're available on their website to download to help individuals lead and manage change. You know, many of our consultants who help clients do this, they are ProSci certified, so they've been through training, they understand these frameworks and different methodologies. But the good news is most of this stuff can be applied just by downloading the tools and understanding the framework. It really just gives you some structure to help attack a problem. You know, that's the challenge that you have in a crisis. It seems like everything is coming at you at once, and it's easy to get overwhelmed. Some of these tools and some of the stories that they share on their site give you confidence and give you a path forward by saying, okay, here's where you start. Do this first, and then do this, and then do this. And it just gives you some kind of structure around how to respond. So I would encourage you to go out and look at ProSci. I think, yep, their website is on the slide. There's a tremendous amount of thought leadership out there that I think you can all benefit from.
You know, I think that it's a good takeaway for that is, you know, when we look at tools and resources like this, I don't know how everybody else feels, but a lot of times I download things like this and I'm feeling really excited, like, yay, yay. And then I start reading it and I begin thinking, oh no, I don't know exactly what the next step is, or I'm not exactly sure, you know. And so if we have anyone in the audience who's new to Aparo, you know, that's kind of the role we help play with nonprofits in this community. When you are seeking tools and processes and resources and trying to figure this stuff out, one of the things that we can do is help you guys leverage skilled volunteers to hold your hand through a journey like this, to help map it out. You don't have to figure this out on your own because it's a lot, especially in the you know, the context of this crazy situation we're in. So yeah, for anybody who's listening in that's not familiar with Aparo, keep that in mind. If this is appealing to you and you don't know what to do or how to get started, reach out to us. That's what we do. We try to help you, match you up with volunteers that can help take you on a journey like this to sort of get to where your goals are. And Sandra, I don't know, maybe you could say a word or two. I think we've done some work with you that may have sort of given you guys a little bit of a leg up in some of the goals that you had.
Yeah, I talk about Aparo to all my nonprofit friends because without that partnership, we wouldn't have the database that we have today. We wouldn't be able to do virtual social work that we're doing today. I mean, there's just so many things, and you guys are awesome. And I think that if you have a question, reach out to them and see if they can find that partnership that's going to work for you, what you need at that moment in time.
I didn't have to pay her but $25 to say that, by the way.
No.
So I appreciate you saying that we're great. I wasn't fishing for that, but thank you for saying it anyway. Yeah, and you know, an example is TJ too. I mean, you know, guys, having access to experts like this to help lead our journeys as we go through these kinds of changes. Wow, what a resource! You know, we're so appreciative of your willingness to help guide us through these things.
If I could just share really quick, our partnership with Aparo was with TJ's firm. And so fast forward 3 years later, TJ is my board chair. So who more than to have TJ as my board chair during this type of crisis management? Things happen for a reason.
I mean, talk about the stars aligning, right?
Yes.
Although, maybe they could have aligned in a different time. And anyway, so guys, I'm keeping an eye on the clock, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We're at 12:55, and so with that, let's begin to bring a little bit of closure to our conversation. TJ, what kinds of closing thoughts, encouragements, advice, whatnot would you like to share with us?
I mean, I guess if I could boil it down, I would say that, you know, understanding your guiding principles, understanding your mission as an organization and the different stakeholders that you engage with, if you use that as the foundation for everything you do, it's really hard for me to see how you get sideways when responding to a crisis. History is filled with examples. The most recent one I could find was Governor Sonny Perdue, 2005, with Hurricane Rita. He made it clear that the safety of his constituents was paramount to him. So he closed all the gas stations in Georgia because he suspected that their oil refineries were going to get smacked by Hurricane Rita, and he wanted to ration the gas. Well, 2 days later, the oil refineries were fine. There was no gas shortage, and people were, quote unquote, very upset about being, put out of sorts for 2 days because he was rationing gasoline. But as he communicated his guiding principles, throughout that process, he was reelected because the guiding principles mattered. When constituents understood why he made the decision he made, that resonated with them. That alignment, that personal connection, that overrode the mistake in his decision. It's hard to call it a mistake, right? He was looking in the crystal ball. But that's what leaders are asked to do. When we're in the midst of a crisis, we're asked to look in a crystal ball and figure out a path forward. If we can always base our judgments and our guidance on those core principles, those reasons why we get up every day and serve the clients and stakeholders that we serve, I think that message is always going to resonate, and it's always going to give us the ability to course correct. So I would close with that thought.
Awesome words of advice. And Sandra, what would you share with your colleagues and peers and friends in the community in terms of, a word of advice or encouragement?
Yeah, I think just what we're learning today and doing today is going to make us better prepared for tomorrow. And part of that I keep hearing in different webinars that I'm in is the new word is fluid in everything that we're doing. And then it's really important to really take care of yourself right now. And you need to make sure that you're prioritizing yourself.
Agreed.
Yes. More words of wisdom that I think we're all trying to remember every day, but they're good words. Take care of ourselves, because frankly, if we're not taking care of ourselves, then we're diminishing what we can then offer to our constituencies and our communities. So with that, folks, I'm going to bring our session to a close. We are so appreciative again of Sandra and TJ's time and sharing their experiences and expertise. And again, for the listening audience, we will make these resources available to you within 24 hours. If there's anything else you'd like to chat about or just brainstorm on or need a little bit of guidance, reach out to Aparo. We've got lots of folks on staff who are more than happy to help. And if we don't know the answer, and trust me, there are a lot of times we don't, we will just say we can go get it from experts like TJ or whomever, because we've got great relationships throughout the community with both nonprofits and our skilled volunteer core. So with that, I thank everyone again for your time and attention. I hope this has been useful for you, and we will look forward to seeing you again on our next session next week. And with that, I thank you. I hope everyone has a great day. TJ, Sandra, thank you again.
Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.